Colorado Springs, 1951. A decorated Air Force officer and his devout Catholic wife build a house that seems to embody the American dream. 12 children, a family of order, faith, discipline, and promise. But behind the shiny front door on Hidden Valley Road, a different story begins to unfold. One by one, 6 of the 10 boys spiral into psychosis. Outbursts of rage, visions in the sky, paranoia that tears apart the bonds that bind them together. Police cars are as familiar as neighbors. Dishes are smashed, picked up in silence each morning. Thanksgiving dinners are overturned, then wiped clean before dawn. This is more than just a family crisis. It becomes the cornerstone of American psychiatric history. The Galvins were studied by the National Institute of Mental Health, their blood stored in cold storage for decades. And when the test tubes were finally decoded, in 2016, scientists discovered a genetic mutation that haunted each sibling, sick and healthy alike. A discovery that proved a risk, but not a fate. Meanwhile, the 2 youngest daughters carried another archive memories of neglect, secrecy, and abuse, things science could never measure. When their parents died, they became living witnesses to a house where silence was the unwritten rule. The Galvin family's story is not just about schizophrenia. It is also about the price of silence, the burden of survivor guilt, and the paradox of science. It explains so much but leaves so much more unexplained. That address, Hidden Valley Road, became a permanent marker order on the outside, chaos on the inside. It is the most documented family legacy in American history about the disease. And tonight, we reopen their files. Before we begin, where are you hearing this story from? Leave your country and local time in the comments. That helps us see how far these stories travel and how many voices come together to remember histories that many would rather forget. If you find value in this investigative storytelling, be sure to subscribe to Sleepy History Tales and turn on notifications. Because history doesn't just live in textbooks. Sometimes it hides in seemingly perfect homes until the silence inside begins to speak. In the years after World War II, the American West became a picture of order, optimism, and expansion. Colorado Springs, with its fresh mountain air and newly established Air Force Academy, was both a symbol and a test case for the model family of the Cold War. It was here in 1951 that Donald and Mimi Galvin began building what their neighbors would later call the perfect American family. To outsiders, they embodied the values that a nation aspired to: discipline, faith, hard work, and fertility. Donald Galvin, or simply Don, was a World War II veteran who had flown across the Pacific and returned with the quiet toughness that characterized his generation. In the 1950s, he taught at the Air Force Academy, training cadets in control and order. That discipline carried over to the home. The measure of authority was not a shout, but a quiet presence of military routine. He rarely raised his voice, but his children always knew the weight of their father's approval or his cold silence. In the family, he was not an emotional figure, but a rank to be obeyed. Mimi, his wife, was the counterweight in family life. A devout Catholic, she was obsessively concerned with ritual cleanliness and appearance. Every corner of the house was gleaming. Every meal was meticulously prepared. Her faith was expressed not in abstract theology, but in quiet sacrifices, keeping the house spotless, raising the children in discipline, and never letting the neighbors see the chaos. If Dawn was the embodiment of authority, Mimi was the embodiment of control. Perfection was more than a preference, it was a survival shield against the scrutiny of the community and the judgment of the church. In the 2 decades between 1945 and 1965, Mimi gave birth to 12 children, 10 boys and 2 girls. The children were raised not as individuals, but as a team. They were often referred to by numbers rather than names. To visitors, it seemed convenient, even fun. But inside the home, it was an extension of order, a way to control the overwhelmingness of a dozen small lives growing up under one roof. The boys were trained, talented, and distinguished. They boxed in the yard under their father's tutelage. Gloves bounced. Each punch echoed like an exclamation point in the family yard. They kept falcons as a gesture of elegance, a strange and luxurious sight against the Colorado mountains. The children were given music lessons, not just for obedience, but also for cultural display, as if the family had not only discipline, but also spiritual depth. The Galvins lived on Hidden Valley Road, a house that became a shining symbol of Cold War prosperity. The house was spacious, shiny, immaculately clean, a symbol that everyone saw. Neighbors admired it. In a time when large Catholic families were celebrated as evidence of faith and vitality, the Galvins were typical. 12 children neatly dressed. The mother was elegant. The father was dignified. Anyone who passed by would think this is the perfect family. In a city closely tied to the military, they seemed to exemplify a common story strength on the battlefield. Discipline at home, a faith that embraced both. But the image carried weight. Once praised as perfect, every crack, however small, had to be hidden. Mimi became obsessively vigilant. Every dish was washed until it sparkled. Every scratch on the floor had to disappear. Even when the door was closed, the children had to maintain a facade. Chaos was not mentioned. The disease, if it surfaced, was tactfully called eccentricity. Conflict, if it flared, was described as mischief. The distance between father and son was wrapped in a single word: discipline. The pressure to maintain the mask was never acknowledged, but it was imprinted on each child. By the late 1950s, the Galvins had become a kind of civic legend. The right man in the right place at the right time. A veteran father teaching at the Air Force Academy. A Catholic mother raising 12 children. A house that from every angle seemed to exemplify the American dream. But inside the gleaming rooms around the quiet dining table, small irregularities began to emerge. One child was lost, his eyes vacant. Another had a sudden outburst of anger. Someone showed unwarranted cruelty or inexplicable recklessness. The neighbors didn't see it. Even Don and Mimi probably wouldn't admit it. But the cracks were there, and the burden of a perfect image would only make the fallout more severe. The Galvin story began not with tragedy, but with order. An order so carefully constructed that it hid the first signs of collapse. In the optimistic atmosphere of 1950s, Colorado Springs, the house on Hidden Valley Road was a monument to control. But beneath the surface, silence had begun to ferment into something else. In every large family, the eldest son established the order. In the Galvins, that role fell to Donald Jr., the son expected to carry on his father's discipline and his mother's desire for refinement. Don Jr. was strong, intelligent, and full of potential, the first example of the Hidden Valley Road dream. But by the 1960s, the eldest son began to drift off course. What had started as eccentricity had turned into behaviors that were difficult to explain. The first incident was later recounted with wry laughter. Don Jr. ran straight through a bonfire at a neighborhood, gathering his body smoking and covered in ash. Some saw it as a youthful dare, a way of showing off his courage. At home, it was considered impulsive, something that adolescents eventually overcame. But the act had a darker tone, like an urge and experiment with one's own body and destruction. Not just a test of boundaries, but a test of death. Soon after came more difficult to hide behaviors. Don Jr.'s strangling of the family cat haunted even his brothers accustomed to strict discipline. It was no accident. It was no prank. It was intentional, incomprehensible, and cruel. But in that house, it was never called by its proper name. Mimi silenced everyone, telling the younger ones that her brother was just having a hard time and forbade any mention of it outside the home. To truly admit it meant facing the fact that the order had lost control. By the late 1960s, the spiral had only intensified. Don Jr. attempted suicide with cyanide. No one could say it was just youthful recklessness. He was committed to the state facility in Pueblo. There, the doctors wrote down a chilling name in his file: paranoid schizophrenia, the first of many tragedies that awaited the Galvins. It was the first official diagnosis recorded in the Galvin family records, a heavy, stigmatizing label in those days. To psychiatrists, it was a clinical fact, but to the Galvins, it was an intrusion, a word too dangerous to utter. Don the father played it down. To his Air Force Academy colleagues, he said little deftly, casting his son's troubles as a result of stress or bad choices. Mimi went further. She refused to use the word. For her, schizophrenia was not just a disease, but a sentence that would define not just her son, but the entire family. In that house, the disease was replaced by euphemisms. Don Jr. was just going through a phase or being sad. Medical language was erased, replaced by false reassurances as if the disorder were temporary. But the permanence was already there, written into the medical records and discharge papers. The treatment in Pueblo was not an isolated event, but the opening page of a family archive of illness. Doctors prescribed medication therapy, but neither parent ever acknowledged it publicly. Treatment, yes, but hidden. And the silence that followed Don Jr.'s diagnosis became a template for how the family dealt with any subsequent cracks. The younger children learned the lesson quickly. When Don Jr. returned, his behavior was still erratic. Sudden tantrums, strange obsessions, moments of detachment from reality. Sometimes he would whisper to his shadow, sometimes mumble conspiracies that only he could see. But at home, everyone was told to carry on as if nothing had happened. Appearances were more important than acknowledgement. When neighbors asked, the Galvins told them about Don Jr.'s talents, his health, his future. The truth, the fire, the cat. The cyanide bottle was buried in silence. In the 1960s, schizophrenia was still misunderstood. Many theories blamed the environment, especially the mother. Academic texts spoke of schizophrenic mothers cold domineering, breaking the minds of their children. Science would later disprove them, but the mere shadow of that accusation was enough to make Mimi more secretive. Calling the disease by its proper name was tantamount to indictment. Silence was safer. And so the immaculate house on Hidden Valley Road, still shiny, still admired by the neighbors, now hid a hidden fault line. The eldest son had moved from eccentric to sick, from disorder to diagnosis. The family did not confront it, but covered it up. Euphemisms became policy. Secrecy became a shield. The first crack was there, and it began to spread. The Galvin family's story of mental illness did not begin with science or research. It began with smoke, with cruelty, with a bottle of cyanide, and with a word that was forbidden in that very house. Silence did not heal it, only left the family unprepared for the next tragedy. And once the first crack was buried, they could only hope it would remain a single fracture. But the diagnosis that marked Don Jr. did not stop with the eldest son. By the 1970s, 5 more sons had broken down, each in his own way. What emerged was not a single case, but a consistent pattern. So tragic that the Galvins became one of the largest clusters of schizophrenics ever documented. Next came James or Jim. He cycled between paranoia and rage with a speed that terrified both his siblings and the police, who were called to the house. The rage was often turned against himself one night. Jim banged his head against the wall so hard that it left a dent that Mimi quietly painted over. But sometimes the violence would burst forth, objects would shatter, brothers would be cornered, screams would echo through the gleaming house. The hallucinations would never leave him. The invisible voice would accuse command. When the doctor diagnosed schizophrenia, it was not just a line in a file. It was confirmation of what the family had been living through for years. Then there was Brian. His instability grew more dangerous. Anger, mood swings. Temperament could collapse into violence without warning. By his 20s, his temper had reached its peak and ended in tragedy. They did not testify with the usual decisiveness of a trial. Instead, each word that emerged from their mouths was like a memory pulled from the mud, heavy and reluctant. Many of them had been silent for decades, and the moment they stood before the jury made them tremble as if they were committing a crime all over again. An elderly woman, her white hair draped over her veil, had to stop several times to cry. She was not just talking about a terrible night, she was reliving it. As the drops of candlelight fell to the wooden floor, the audience seemed to listen, not only with their ears, but also with their held breaths. Each witness walked unsteadily as they left the stand, as if the memory had just ripped open another wound. More than a few confessed that they had prayed to God to let them forget, but now, instead of being freed, they were forced to expose everything to the light. And perhaps it was in that trembling that the truth emerged more clearly than any evidence. The house gradually bore the marks of violence. Chairs broke, cabinets fell, dishes shattered. There was one famous occasion. Thanksgiving dinner turned into chaos. The table was overturned, glasses and plates shattered on the floor. But by the next morning, all traces were gone. Mimi made concealment her mission. Chairs were replaced, walls repainted, dishes bought. The house was shiny and clean again, while the foundation underneath was rotting. Medical treatment became a permanent habit. The medicine cabinet was filled with vials of thorazine, stelazine, haldol, lithium, lined up like tools in a workshop. At one point, the doctor tried electroshock therapy, hoping to quell the hallucinations. Nothing brought healing. The drugs only dulled the extremes, but in return the eyes were blank, the gait shaky, the body sluggish. When that failed, the violence and delusions flared up again as if nothing had changed. The house now resembled Pueblo Psychiatric Hospital, only without the staff and the procedures. The father Don had sunk deeper into his military shell. He chose to be absent taking on extra hours on the reserve, often coinciding with crises at home. His silence and aloofness were as resonant as any shouting match. Mimi had tightened the code of silence into dogma. She demanded that her children appear in public as a model Catholic family, neat, disciplined, holy. Inside, she picked up the pieces, put the furniture back together, and explained away the police cars as if they were small things. Her job was not just to clean up, it was to erase the truth. The silence was as oppressive as the violence. The children quickly learned that speaking out was tantamount to betrayal. Mentioning the police cars, the broken chairs, the pill bottles, it was breaking ranks. The house demanded secret complicity. Everyone shouldered the responsibility for maintaining the facade of perfection. The reality? It was a psychiatric facility. The only difference is that the patients are siblings and the nurses and orderlies don't exist. Thanksgiving is shattered in the middle of a psychotic episode. The living room becomes an emergency room. The bedroom becomes a prison cell. Every morning, everything is cleaned up, the cracks covered. The family lives in two parallel worlds, the pristine facade that the neighbors admire, and the darkness behind the door, a prison that mixes hallucinations, violence, and fear. Hidden Valley Road is no longer an address. It becomes a diagnosis. With 12 children, the two youngest girls should have been protected. But Margaret and Lindsay were not. When the sisters started school, the house was no longer a home but a crossroads of madness, secrets, and danger. Their earliest memories are not of family picnics, but of locked doors, screams from other rooms. As the brothers spiraled into a paranoid storm, the sisters were locked in their rooms, listening to the house shake with a rage they could not understand. Chairs broke, dishes shattered, words turned to threats, and all they could hear from the other side of the door. The sounds of their childhood were not laughter, but growls, fists, pounding against walls, and heavy silences after each tantrum. The bedroom door, instead of protection, became bars that kept the two children inside so they could hear every crash but could not escape. The outbursts sometimes turned directly on them, not with punches, but with harassment violations that no one dared to name. Margaret and Lindsay soon understood that no one would save them. Even the priest, who was supposed to be their support, became a hurtful person, then swallowed up in the same shell of silence. Family church hospital, places that used to represent safety, were now just walls of complicity, covering up what was not allowed to be said. In front of outsiders, the two sisters became model students, quiet, diligent. Books were an escape, classrooms, a refuge, desks, a substitute for the cracked walls at home. Lindsay the younger had found her way out of Hidden Valley Road with knowledge. Margaret was burdened, caught between two poles, wanting to protect the family's honor and longing to break the silence that had suffocated them. As time passed, they became the keepers of memories, the unwilling witnesses of that house. They told stories not to attract attention, but because silence was the greatest danger. Without them, the Galvin's history was only diagnoses and prescriptions. With them, the story became a broader mirror of hidden violence, of failed institutions, of how silence can be both armor and weapon. In those years, silence was no longer a habit, but a means of survival. Mimi understood that admitting to the illness in the family was tantamount to condemning herself. The theory that the mother gave birth to mental illness still hovered like a ghost. A confession was enough to turn all eyes not on the children, but on her. But that silence could not cover up the tragedy that struck in 1973. Brian, one of the sons, killed his close girlfriend, then turned the gun on himself. That double death could no longer allow the Galvin family to hide in the dark. For the first time, what Mimi had tried to keep hidden appeared publicly in the press, in police records, in cold obituaries. She called it fate, an unexpected disaster. But the children understood that the story was inseparable from the diagnosis, the prescription, and the storm that had been brewing for a long time. And then, as if by ritual, the incident was buried with plastered walls, replaced plates, and the quiet words, silence. The cleaner, the house on Hidden Valley Road, became the more oppressive the atmosphere inside. The father Don made absence a habit. The mother Mimi made concealment a calling. And in that void, the children continued to slip away from reality medications, lined up in cabinets, medical records piled high on desks, and the 4 undiagnosed children. They lived as if they were standing in a waiting room. The light above their heads could go out at any moment. Each time they watched a brother collapse into madness, they wondered, when will it be my turn? It was the waiting for the shadow of madness to fall that was the heaviest sentence. The vigilance gradually became a breathing habit. Every moment of forgetfulness, every moment of broken concentration made them whisper the question, has it begun? A voice too loud, an emotion too quickly changed direction, all compared to the collapses they had witnessed in that very house. The waiting was like the weather. The sky was heavy, thunder lurked on the horizon. The storm never really broke, but always made people shiver. They chose their profession not just to live, but to build walls, discipline, control, self-control, thin armor against chaos. But every armor had its flaws. Even after they had moved far away from Hidden Valley Road, the shadow still followed. Every time they thought of marriage, of children, the question arose, will I pass on that invisible seed? And so even love became a calculation of probability. None of the 4 normal brothers had been diagnosed. Their medical records were blank clean. But to say they were unaffected would be wrong. They still carried the guilt of survivors still retreating from the memory, as if each mention might cause the fragile wall to collapse. If the sisters became the keepers of the memory, the 4 brothers chose to avoid it, to go into silence. And so, in the research papers, they were just a footnote, the good guys in a dysfunctional family. But in reality, they were also victims living their whole lives under a sky that had never been clear. By the 1980s, the Galvins were no longer just a private tragedy. They had become a medical phenomenon. 6 of the sons were diagnosed with schizophrenia. 2 of the sisters recounted other wounds. The 4 brothers were not sick, but they always carried silent fear. One doctor, Lynn DeLisi, saw in them not just a family story, but a key. While many psychiatrists were still stuck on the mother's fault theory, this family revealed something else, a secret blueprint, perhaps hidden in the blood. And so the test tubes began to appear. Blood was drawn from brothers, parents, even sisters. Each vial was marked, kept cold in the laboratory. A new archive was born, no longer diaries or police reports, but the blood itself carrying within it the answer to a mystery that had consumed an entire house. The vials of blood were stored deep in freezers, cold storage vaults, designed to outlast the people who donated them. For decades, as tragedy continued to erupt at the Hidden Valley Road house, hospitalizations, violence breakups, the blood lay dormant in the dark, waiting for science to catch up. Every so often, a team would open the freezers experimenting with new techniques. But time and time again, the answer eluded them. The Galvins were noted in scientific papers as a phenomenon, a high-frequency family, but no one could explain the mechanism. Until 2016. That's when scientists turned to modern sequencing technology, and from that long frozen layer, a name emerged. SHANK2, a gene on chromosome 11 that's tied to synaptic activity. The mutation the researchers discovered had been passed down from Mimi herself, the mother. It was present not only in severely ill children, but also in those who never developed the disease. A discovery that was both groundbreaking and paradoxical. It proved that the disease had a clear biological basis, but at the same time affirmed that genes were not destiny. Normal people also carried the same abnormality, but their lives took a different path. The risk was real, but the outcome remained unknown. For scientists, the Galvin family became a testament that forced psychiatry to take a new path, from theories of maternal error to molecular genetic mapping. But for the family itself, the result brought only partial relief. Mimi, although deceased, was partly vindicated from the vicious whispers that had lasted for decades. Yet, the secret in the blood remained unexplained. Why did some people collapse and others not? The test tubes thawed after decades, revealing a mysterious text written in the genetics, like the story of Hidden Valley Road itself. The hidden secret was finally revealed, not to bring certainty, but only to remind us that there were cracks that could never be mended. After their parents died, Dawn in 2003, Mimi in 2017, the long silence in the house was truly broken. The two youngest daughters, Margaret and Lindsay, stepped into the void, carrying with them the memories they had been forced to bury. They told them not as confessions, but as precise records who did what. With the doors that rattled with rage, the nights when furniture was barricaded in front of the room, the rush each morning to cover up the evidence of violence. These stories, absent from medical records, absent from genetic studies, but they are the missing piece of that family legacy. A ruthless economy of silence where concealment always precedes responsibility and fear becomes the common language. The younger daughter's accounts reshaped the entire story. Previously, Galvin's name had appeared in books only as a clinical case study, a large family in which 6 sons were diagnosed with schizophrenia, a pillar of the genetics revolution. But Margaret and Lindsay emphasize another truth. The house was not just a medical record, but also an archive of unspoken trauma. Police records might record addresses. Hospitals might record diagnoses. But nowhere did they find the sense of what it was like to grow up in a house that had become a hospital. Their accounts provided the missing material, the lived experience calm and haunting. Margaret spoke of a policy of silence, where every crack had to be patched, every word replaced with a harmless-sounding phrase. We learned to use school as a refuge, to read books, to build structure, to keep friends at a safe distance, so they wouldn't see what home really looked like, Lindsay adds. We learned from a young age, the truth has a price, and those who speak it, pay it. When their parents died, the gatekeepers of silence disappeared. The sisters stepped forward to tell their story, not just for the writers, but for the historical record. What they brought was not in opposition to the science, but in addition a necessary counterweight. The frozen test tubes, the 2016 paper on the SHANK2 mutation, explained the risk. But it was the daughter's testimony that showed how that risk was lived through every room, every meal, every morning of concealment. The story came full circle when Lindsay's daughter entered the lab where the family had been studied. A grandchild entering the very stream of science that had taken the blood of his mother and uncle. A continuation, but also a reclamation of autonomy, not just as a subject of study, but as a participant. The decision did not bring closure, but turned legacy into work, turned burden into action. Still, no narrative can erase the trauma, and no scientific work can repair a roof that had been shattered decades earlier. But speaking up still changes the distribution of memory's weight. Previously, the name Galvin had been seen as a testament to psychiatry. Now the sisters forced it to have historical significance as well. In their memories, there were no dramatic accusations. There was only a steadfastness records of dates, police visits, broken objects, buried cracks. In this arrangement, a moral emerges. Science is allowed to be precise, but it is not allowed to obscure the human record. As the 21st century enters its first decade, the Galvins are no longer just a phenomenon in the medical literature. They become a double record in the laboratory. Blood holds the secret of a mutation. In the memories of the two daughters, the house holds evidence that the wrist does not travel alone. It always carries silence. And finally, when the parents disappear, the documents remain and the daughters speak. The past does not change, but it becomes visible. They became icons. 6 sons diagnosed with schizophrenia spent the rest of their lives in hospitals. 4 others seemingly unscathed, but living in constant doubt. Was it their turn? And 2 daughters unsick, but scarred by the silence that protected no one. Their story spans the lab, the pages of books, and the public imagination. It shows how mental illness can scar a family. The parents are long gone. The father, who chose distance rather than confrontation, died in 2003. The mother died in 2017, taking with her the rituals of secrecy until the end. Their legacy is not property, but an archive of memories held in the hands of their children. Partly medical records, partly testimony, partly absence. 2 sons still live in the hospital, their old age contained within the walls that replaced the old house. Another died in 2023 quietly in his sleep, a small end, but one that carries the weight of history. In 2020, when Hidden Valley Road was published, this private story became public. It portrayed the Galvin family as both a crumbling house and a mirror to the whole field of psychiatry. From the mother's fault theory to the search for genes to more complex understandings, risk spectrum interaction between environment and genetics. The book was read in living rooms, in classrooms on best of the year lists, and turned a once hidden address into a collective memory. The influence did not stop with the pages. A television project was signed, bringing the story to the screen. In popular culture, Galvin's name became a shorthand for the extreme, a family in which half the children succumbed as if the odds were stacked against a single bloodline. To scientists, they were more than symbols. They were data. Blood samples, charts. The SHANK2 mutation on chromosome 11, evidence of risk, but not of fate. It was a paradox, 664, not the same mutation. Risk did not come with certainty. Biology did not mean inevitability. To the family, scientific progress could not raise the locked doors, the shivering evenings, or the suffocation of a house turned hospital. But Margaret and Lindsay's testimony changed the record. Not just the diagnosis, but the details of life. The evasion, the cover-up, the survival. They retained a memory that science could not measure. The address Hidden Valley Road was no longer just a street. It has become a symbol etched into history, a neat house on the outside, but chaos inside. A Catholic family on Sundays, but police calls and broken furniture during the week. It represents the gap between surface and reality. Galvin's legacy exists on many planes. In the laboratory where the frozen blood tubes still stand. In literature where their story is preserved as a cultural text. In memory, where their daughters insist that silence is part of the diagnosis. And in the absence of their remaining brothers who died quietly in 2023, they transformed psychiatry, expanded the public imagination about schizophrenia, and left a cultural mark. But they will also forever be what they were, a human archive of suffering which science can record but never erase. Hidden Valley Road is more than an address. It is a sign in history, a reminder that behind every smooth wall, there may be cracks that have been there for generations. The Galvins gave the world more than stories. They gave blood, words, and silence. Science can explain. History can record. But nothing can fix. And when silence lasts too long, it becomes a kind of legacy, something that future generations are forced to carry.